In this third video, we'll look at Washington's domestic policies, and we'll begin to look at them anyway. And a lot of that, of course, revolves around the economy and the proposals of Alexander Hamilton. So this is the first of two videos looking at that. Anyway, after appointing his cabinet, Washington had little to do, kind of waiting for Congress to emerge, legislation to emerge from Congress. Congress, after approving Washington's appointments, began debating the Bill of Rights, as I've noted earlier, and you can see a draft of the Bill of Rights on the right. Washington would, on Tuesday he agreed to meet with various men's. On Friday night was always a tea party. Wednesday he had a dinner at 4 p.m. for selected guests, and he welcomed both sexes then, but he was kind of just a figurehead, and he was deferring to Congress, waiting for legislation to emerge. Congress recognized, of course, as did everybody, they needed to establish more than just a Supreme Court, and they needed a broader court system. So they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. It sort of defined the jurisdiction of the federal judiciary and established officially the Supreme Court with 6 members, which they said would include a Chief Justice and 5 what they called associate justices. The federal jurisdiction, of course, pertains to the violation of federal law and disputes between states, and each state, of course, had its own state judicial system, their own state Supreme Court and so forth. But so this federal court system was just pertaining to the federal law or disputes between states. But anyway, the Judiciary Act of 1789 also established 13 district courts and 3 appellate courts. It's all called circuit courts because they would actually rotate around. The judges would ride the circuits to various towns. But anyway, they established those courts, and then Washington had to appoint the members of these judges down the line. By making the federal judiciary the settlers of disputes between states, it was a strong statement of federal sovereignty. As Washington waited and then signed the legislation that came to him, Congress debated. Secretary of Treasury Hamilton issued 3 economic proposals, the first of which was known as the Report on Public Credit, shown here on the right. It involved what people referred to as the issue of funding. In the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress had issued bonds that people would loan the Continental Congress money to wage the war. However, because the Articles of Confederation had been unable to pay, and we discussed this, bondholders had sold some of their bonds at a depreciated value to speculators. And the question now, therefore, was, to whom shall the new government pay? The original bondholders or the speculators? Hamilton's report on public credit recommended that the government pay at full price and with all incurred interest to whoever presently held the bonds, whether they were their speculator or not. It was important, Hamilton argued, that the nation's credit be respected, or no one in the future would loan us money. To pay for this expense, Hamilton argued that the U.S. should issue new bonds. Now, in other words, Hamilton proposed new loans, which would ensure a national debt. Hamilton was way ahead of his time, recognizing that a national debt in the form of bonds could help grow the economy and help the government cover unexpected or emergency expenses. While Hamilton had no problem with the use of national debt, he refused to expand the money supply by having the U.S. print paper money. And I've already talked about in a previous video the Coinage Act of 1792, which passed and allowed for a national mint to produce specie coins, gold and silver and so forth. But Hamilton always resisted a national paper currency. All the coins the U.S. minted could be redeemed in an appropriate amount of gold, the gold standard, and the banks claimed that they would let their own banknotes be redeemed in gold. So the U.S. remained on the gold standard in its money in all of its forms. Banknotes or non-gold specie coins could be redeemed for gold, and the whole system therefore varied depending on the price of gold. Jefferson disagreed regarding the funding issue. Jefferson argued that the United States owed its original patriots who had sacrificed during the war, not the greedy, speculators who took personal advantage of another's distress. Now, in the end, however, Hamilton's plan passed Congress, and Washington, siding with Hamilton, signed it. What you're going to see is, as I go through Hamilton's economic program, is you're going to see Washington consistently siding with Hamilton. And that's going to sort of make Washington, when you think of the Federalist era, you think of Washington siding with the Federalists, Washington being part of the Federalist era. He didn't like the merging political factions, but every decision he did sort of strengthened the federal government's authority. And agreeing with Hamilton on the issue of funding was one of many ways. Entering a new debate at the same time, Hamilton also proposed a solution to the issue known as assumption. Now, this revolved around should the new government lump all the state debts together and pay them off as, one national debt, or should each individual state pay off its own debts? Hamilton proposed that all debts be combined and paid for by the national government, and he argued that it could help create a true nation. He also pointed out that most of the state debts were held by wealthy speculators in those states, and if the federal government assumed those debts, these wealthy speculators would be more likely to support the federal government and not just the states over whom they held so much sway. And you can see here newspaper reports on Hamilton's assumption plan. Once again, Jefferson disagreed. Many states, most in the South, had not incurred the same war debts as the states in the North, Jefferson noted. Moreover, many states in the South had been more diligent paying off their debt, and to combine them into one national debt now, Jefferson argued, it'd be unfair to those southern states who had been so good in paying off their debts. With Jefferson's resistance, Hamilton's assumption plan stalled in Congress until Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on a compromise. They met on a street and agreed to talk it out. Southerners who had resisted assumption, they also worried that the national capital had been operating in New York City. If it continued there, they feared, the government might become indifferent to the South's concerns, which of course revolved around slavery. To solve the dispute, Jefferson and Hamilton agreed to dinner one night, and in that dinner they agreed on a compromise. The nation's capital would be moved to some location further southward than New York City and be created in a federal district that was in no one state. Until this federal district was created, however, the capital would move temporarily southward from New York City to the city of Philadelphia. And you can see a draft of the compromise agreement on the right. Both men agreed to let Washington choose a site. Washington chose a site on the Potomac River, which divided Maryland from Virginia, very near his Mount Vernon estate. The new District of Columbia would include land from both states, the new capital city, and the existing towns of Georgetown, Maryland, and Alexandria, Virginia. The agreement was to lay out a 10-mile by 10-mile square and then locate the new capital city right where the Potomac River split north of Alexandria and east of Georgetown. And if you go there today, the southern half of this in Virginia is not part of the District of Columbia because later on the federal government gave it back to the state of Virginia, and the District of Columbia is just the original part in Maryland. Commissioners appointed to oversee construction of the new city hired the Frenchman Pierre L'Enfant to conduct surveying and lay out a plan for the streets, the federal buildings, and the private lots to be sold. The commissioners decided to name the new capital city in honor of George Washington, and they called it Washington. L'Enfant submitted a grand plan for the nation's capital. He picked a site on the prominent hill in the area, Capitol Hill is to be called, for the new Capitol building. And overlaying the land was a grid system of streets and lots, and they would all emanate from this Capitol building. There would be 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, and then A Street, B Street, C Street, all flowing from the Capitol building. And overlaying the grid of the streets and lots would be grand boulevards named for the states. And where they met, there'd be traffic circles and with statutes. It kind of reminded him of Paris, which is where he got the idea. In this map that Lafont laid out, you can see that there was a mall moving westward from the Capitol building and going in front of the president's mansion. But there's also a canal you can see here, which of course no longer exists. In any event, the compromise on the nation's capital ended the economic issue of assumption, and this concludes the first of the 2 videos on Washington's domestic policy, focusing on the economic issues and Hamilton's economic plans.